Good afternoon. Welcome to a presentation by Dr. Carolyn Finney, the first part of the annual meeting of Faith Communities Together for a Sustainable Future. My name is John Elder. I'm a member of the FACT board. Since 2011, FACT Ohio has been bringing together lay people and clergy of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and other faith traditions in fighting against the fossil fuel industry's reckless poisoning of Ohio's air, water, and soil. A major endeavor of FACT is the Ohio Health Project. The Ohio Health Project registrars are gathering baseline data from people who believe their health may be harmed by fracking and activities associated with it, including the emerging petrochemical enterprises in the Ohio River Valley. You will learn more about the work of FACT in the business meeting that will follow the presentation by Dr. Finney. FACT has been joined in sponsoring Dr. Finney's time with us today by several other organizations, including Ashtabula, Geauga, and Lake County Farmers Union, Ashtabula County NAACP, Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus, East Shore UU Church's Social Justice Cafe, First Church in Oberlin UCC's Green Team, Northeast Ohio Coalition for a Green New Deal, Sunrise Movement Cleveland, and West Shore FACT. Our thanks to all these and others for their support. Carolyn Finney is a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer. The aim of her work is to develop greater cultural competency within environmental organizations and institutions, challenge media outlets on their representation of difference, and increase awareness of how privilege shapes who gets to speak on environmental issues and determine policy and action. She is presently scholar in residence at Middlebury College. I hope that many of you have prepared for Dr. Finney's conversation with us today by watching her Middlebury TED Talk, Whose Story Counts? And reading her recent article in The Guardian, The Perils of Being Black in Public. We Are All Christian Cooper and George Floyd. Following her opening remarks, Dr. Finney will engage in conversation with us. All of you will be muted. To ask a question or make a comment, if you are on Zoom, you can use the chat box. If you are on Facebook, you may make a comment. Father Neil Pizzulo will curate the questions and comments. Please be respectful of the desires of others to comment and make your comments as brief as possible. During the presentation, you will be entered into a raffle, and 3 of you will win a copy of Dr. Finney's superb book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. You will be asked to provide the information, including whether you want a print version of the book or a Kindle e-version, so we can send you the book. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Finney. Her topic for our conversation today is Christian Cooper, John Muir, and me.
I love it. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody at FACT, everybody you said who helped make this moment. I heard you, heard all the names of the organizations, and I'm sorry that I can't remember them all, but I'm really grateful to you all for inviting me here today and making it possible for me to be here today. So here's how I'd love for the hour to go. I'm going to spend a little time talking, just, some introduction, put up a couple of slides, a couple of images, because I like to use images. But I don't want to spend the whole time talking, because actually I want us to be in conversation. But I like to put some things out there about who I am, my own bias in this conversation, how I'm situated, sort of the larger context that we're all in, though we may not all see it in the same way. And then hopefully kind of open up the door to hear what you all are thinking about and how I might engage with that. So I'm really excited to do that. So I'm going to put up my little PowerPoint slide, my little share screen. I'm getting better at this. Like so many of you, I'm doing this, it feels like 100 times a day. All right, that was supposed to be. I love this art by Ruud van Empel, who is a Dutch artist, that he takes kids and he takes their pictures of them in the outdoors in green space, but then he kind of amplifies them so it almost looks magical to see them. So, okay. Yeah, I'm going to put this up here. I love Richard Pryor, Racism, It's an Ugly Thing. I hope someday we can give it up. But the image you see there is a really famous image of John Muir. And then you've got Christian Cooper, and I'm sure all of you know what happened when Christian Cooper, who I self-identifies as African-American and as gay, was bird watching in New York City in a park, and a white woman named Amy Cooper, in my opinion, weaponized his skin color against him, felt threatened for whatever reasons, and we can have a conversation about what that's about, but threatened to call the police on him. And the whole thing was videoed and it became an incident. I think one of the reasons it became so elevated in our conversations, because this is not new. We have a number of stories that were videoed over the years. The person in Oakland who, accused Black people of not using their grill correctly. There are so many stories. I have stories. I know other people who look like me who have stories. But I think that one of the reasons it hit a particular nerve at this time in our country is because about 2 days later, George Floyd was murdered on camera as well. And so while that is also not new, there's actually, unfortunately, nothing new about that incident except for George Floyd himself. It was something about those two incidents happening at the same time. And for me, I think of them as being on a continuum, right? I think it's on a continuum of experience because what's underneath the roots are the same. It's 400 years come home to roost in a very particular way, right? I think on one end of the spectrum, you have Black people who are afraid to be out in public, and it doesn't matter where that is, they could be killed. And actually, you don't have to be out in public to be killed, as we've discovered. At the other end of the continuum, so many of us live in a constant state of insecurity. Doesn't mean we don't do things in the outdoors, but we may be stopped, we may be challenged, we may be stared at, who knows what might happen just because we're out in the outdoors, thinking that we look like everybody else in terms of what we're doing, how we're dressed, how we're showing up there, but can be challenged by that. And so part of the conversation that I want to have is, the challenge of trying to understand all those things together at the same time. And often I find that in the environmental movement, in the mainstream environmental movement, John Muir, wilderness, conservation, national parks, thinking about the outdoors, in terms of recreation, privileging that lens of recreation, or privileging the lens of, the outdoors is just a supermarket of resources for our use, but not necessarily thinking about things like labor, people who work in the outdoors and on the land, and people who are engaged very differently because of their circumstances and or their desire, right? And how they don't fit into that mainstream narrative in quite the same way. But within that mainstream narrative, my experience has been that the environment, and I work with a lot of amazing environmental organizations, individuals in government agencies, academic institutions. I'm not here to diminish any of those groups. But what I understand is, and this is the funny thing about privilege, is that there's this way within which the environmental movement has historically thought of itself separate from what some might call the social and cultural ills of our time, in this case, systemic racism. What I'm here to say, and you may already know this, but I'll have to say it again, is that systemic racism is everywhere. There's no park sign that it stops at the park gate. Right? It doesn't stop because you're on a beach. It doesn't stop if you're on a mountain. And in particular, if you look like me, or if you look like someone different from the expected majority, which actually that is also changing in this country, then it doesn't stop. So you're going to consider that, which doesn't mean you desire any less to be in the outdoors. It doesn't mean you love it any less. It doesn't mean that you're not engaged with nature any less. If I'm correct in my facts, the biggest voting bloc on environmental issues are African Americans, right? The Black Caucus. When we really start to understand what is that about, and why is there kind of a separation in the way we think about issues having to do with the environment. The other thing that I always have to say is, and people always hear me say, is I have to talk about my own bias, and that I believe all knowledge is subjective, that we bring who we are to bear upon anything it is we're trying to understand. We kind of come to this conversation about the environment, sustainability, racism, John Muir, wherever we're talking about it, we're coming to it in part through our own experience. So I have to always tell you a little bit about my own story as it relates to the environment, to give you some sense of where I stand, right? That's me holding a zinnia that my father had planted way back in the early days of the 1960s. But what I want to talk about is where I grew up a little bit. Yes. So those are my parents, Rose and Henry. So in the late 50s, that photo was taken. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the time, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was segregated. They both came from really large families. They both have a high school education. They were very poor growing up. Oprah used to say there's poor and then po. They were po growing up. And then my dad went off to fight in the Korean War. And when he came back from the Korean War, like a lot of African Americans who lived in the South, the thought was, I'm going to move north. My father told me a story of how he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform, and he thought that looked like a really great government job, right? So he went to apply, and here he was a veteran. And what the people told him at that time was, I'm sorry, we don't hire Negroes. So my father has always harbored something against the National Park Service, which is funny because his daughter went on to serve 8 years on the National Parks Advisory Board, but you know how those things go and come around, right? So my parents moved to New York. My father had a sister who had moved there, and she was a nurse and had been very successful. So they came to New York. My father got 2 job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. The other was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. A very wealthy Jewish family called the Tishmans had an estate. They had a 12-acre estate. They needed full-time caretakers for that estate. So the pictures you're seeing there with the house, down at the bottom right of your screen, all the trees, as well as me in my little Sunday Easter outfit, are all from that estate. So my father took that job. My parents took that job. My father was the chauffeur. He was the landscape gardener. My mom was the sometime housekeeper. There's a second house on this property that's significantly bigger that the Tishmans would come up to on weekends and holidays. There was a swimming pool, a small pond with fish, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, woods, stunning, long driveway. This place was simply stunning. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 1990s. A Japanese American woman moved in at that time. She stayed for a few years and then she moved out. When my parents first got there in the late 50s, they wanted to have kids. And they thought they couldn't have kids, which is its own separate story about the way that my mother, and I think a lot of poor women, regardless of the color of their skin, were treated at that time. And so they adopted me. So I benefited from that. So they adopted me. And then what I like to say is that then they relaxed and they had my first brother. And then they did some more relaxing, some years passed, and they had my second brother. So Tishmans were only there on weekends and holidays, mostly. My brothers and I were outside all the time. It was like our own private park. We all knew how to swim by the time we were 7 years old because of the water on the property. My parents made sure we had swimming lessons at the local Y. I was outside all the time, so we were just outdoor babies all the time. But the story that I tell people, I didn't mention, one thing I forgot to mention, which is the significant wealth in this neighborhood. So it was an entirely white neighborhood. We were the only family of color, but the wealth here was very significant. Harry Winston had property down the street. Many of you will remember Schaefer Beer. Schaefer Beer lived next door in this like stone castle. At least I thought it was a castle as a kid. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. So when I was 9, so my brothers and I, we were, because of where we were in Mamaroneck, we were associated with a great school district and great public schools. And we went to Mamaroneck Avenue School for elementary school. So I could walk home, like 15 minutes. I could walk up the hill, this windy hill, 2-lane road, and I could walk home. And at that time, it felt safe to do so in the 60s. And there was always policemen patrolling this area because you have so much wealth in this area. And I was right around the corner from the house, and a white policeman in his car, he stopped me, and he asked me where I was going. And I gave him the address, 1000 Old White Plains Road, right around the corner. And I had my school bag, I had little reading glasses. I looked like a little girl coming from school time of day. And then he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I remember thinking, dude, that's really weird. I didn't say dude at that time, but I was thinking, that's a strange question. And I said, "No, I live there." Like, what? I mean, I knew my parents worked there, but and he said, "Oh," and he let me go. When I went home, I told my parents about it. My father got so angry that he called the police station, and he really gave them a hard time. And after that, they didn't bother me and my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to think about what the logics were there. Because for me, there was nothing logical about that. I was a 9-year-old girl. It was mid-late afternoon when school lets out. I had a school bag. I was dressed, like a little 9-year-old, you might expect a little 9-year-old girl to be dressed. Why did he think I was working there and not just living there and maybe checking on me to make sure I could get home? About a month and a half ago, all the little news stories that came out, there was a story that came out of a young girl who was 15. Her first name happens to be Brianna, an African-American girl. But this story takes place in Wellington, Florida. And the story was, she lived with her African-American grandfather in this wealthy neighborhood in a place called Wellington, Florida. She was walking with her 2 white friends. And there's an actual video of an older white man pointing to her and saying, "You don't belong here." Right? And I have to tell you, I had a visceral reaction because I just went, that's, the policeman didn't tell me I didn't live there, but boy, he was challenging in my mind, my right to be there. And he was trying to understand what I was doing there in the first place. And the only thing I could think about this young Brianna, 15, was the scar that was going to give her. That's a scar, right? Because it's an indicator. It's an indicator about how she thinks about herself, what right she has to think about herself in a certain way, to be challenged about being in an outdoor space. If you think she's not going to carry that with her when she considers other outdoor spaces that she's walking, I'm willing to bet, the 5 cents in my pocket, that's not the case, right? So I want to jump ahead a little bit. I want to jump ahead to the 90s. Now my parents have been caring for this land for 40 years. Mr. Tishman had died many years earlier. Mrs. Tishman was very sick. So she knew she was going to be, passing away soon. And she wanted to figure out what's going to happen to my parents. To her credit, she tried to keep them on this land. In the 90s, this property was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were over $125,000 a year. My dad was making like $25,000 a year. She even considered paying those taxes, but her grown children, it's complicated, made sure that wasn't going to happen. So she had a house built for my parents in Leesburg, Virginia. And the only reason they picked Leesburg is because at this point, all 3 of us were grown-ups, and my youngest brother was married with kids, and that's where he had settled. I probably will never settle, and my other brother wasn't settled anywhere either. So that's where they moved, even though my father swore he was never moving back to the state of Virginia. So it's a beautiful house. She passed away. My parents stayed on. The new owner came on. My parents stayed on until 2003 because they have to always have somebody here taking care of this property full time. They eventually found a family who were originally from the Dominican Republic who moved in. So the house you're looking at is the gardener's cottage where we lived. Then my parents finally moved, 2003. So now they've been caring for this land for nearly 50 years. They get to Leesburg. Their house is on about a half an acre of land. Like I said, it's a lovely home. And I watched my father in particular get very depressed. And what he talked about was missing the land. place, he thought of land, place, and home as all being the same thing. And for him, it was this property here in New York, where they had spent 50 years of their life, their labor, and their love. A little time after that, they received a copy of a letter from one of their neighbors, and I carry around a copy of this letter, and the letter was from the Westchester Land Trust. The letter had pictures of the estate, and it was letting everyone know in the old neighborhood that a conservation easement has now been placed on this estate. What that means is that in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. And it talked about all the environmental values of this estate and why it should be protected. It talked about where it sits in the watershed. It talked about the wildlife, all the flora and fauna. It talked about everything, why we need to take care of this piece of land, which I don't disagree with. At the end of the letter, which was about a page and a half long, the Westchester Land Trust thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. The new owner had been on for about 3 years. There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who'd cared for the land for nearly 50 years. And just that fast, they were erased. They were erased from the environmental history of that place, from that land. Their story was gone. Our story as a family was gone. And it's at that point I had returned to school. I was working on my doctorate, and I was looking at issues of gender, environment. I was thinking about these things that I really started thinking about race, because I started thinking about all the people in the history of this country who have been erased from their place on the land, from their labor, their love of the land, however you define land, whether it's in the mountains, the woods, the beach, the city park, but who have become invisible in that conversation. And so then we leap to this myth of Black people don't fill in the blanks, right? Black people don't camp, hike, da, 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 da. So therefore, they're not aware, they don't care, and we make our choices to engage from a particular point of view that I will say, and I say this very gently, is actually, at best, it's misguided, but actually it's wrong. It's actually missing a key component of understanding about a group of people who have always been present, who have always been engaged. And this is why you can't get away from the systemic racism, because it also says something about who we value more than others. The idea, whose humanity counts. Because at the end of the day, we're all human, but this isn't about whitewashing or saying that we don't see color, because then that means we really don't see the person either. But to understand that, not everyone's humanity has been valued in the same way in this country. And it makes no difference if we're talking about the environment. So for me, when we talk about sustainability, I always ask the question, what is it that we're trying to sustain? Because it's always about relationship, as far as I'm concerned. It can be about relationship to place, to land, to that forest, to trees, but it is also about our relationship to each other. And for me, we can't do one without the other. If we think we can go out and take care of that river without tending to our relationships with each other, I think we're setting ourselves up for going on this gerbil wheel where we're pretending we don't have to deal with what we see as the hard stuff over here. And the hard stuff has always existed. And for some people, that's where they live 24/7. So my interest is, how do we both, one, sort of own where we are? How do we come to know what that is? Our positionality about where we stand, right? It's not about erasing it or diminishing it or thinking that in order to make space for someone else, I have to back up and become small. Actually, I believe we have the capacity that everybody can actually stand in the same place. We don't have to agree to the same thing. It's not about agreement here for me at all. But it is about how do we come to a common set of aspirations and intentions in doing this kind of work. A couple more things I want to say, then I'll stop talking. I always like to, I may not stop talking, but I will at least let you say something. I always like to put up this slide about convergence, about this moment. And I've been saying this for a few years, saying that for me, it's always about a moment of convergence. But I mean, 2020 is something else, right? 2020 is something else. And a friend of mine who is older and much wiser than I said, yeah, it's 2020, but it's like 2020 vision. Maybe we are gaining a kind of clarity we've never actually had before. So you think about, and I can only put up a handful of pictures there of just things over time: slavery, Japanese internment, Native American genocide and removal, all the things that have happened all the time. George Floyd's murder in the background, the connections these have. But what I've done a little differently is that kind of to my right, the center, is a famous black and white photo of John Muir and President Roosevelt. And this is 1903, Yosemite, overhanging rock. And we're told that they were having really important conversations because these men helped define the idea of wilderness and conservation, to the extent Gifford Pinchot really coined that. He's the guy on the other side with the mustache who started the Forest Service and the whole idea of forest management, and that we can manage resources for our use. So these three men did some significant thinking, significant work, and significant contributing to how we operate today, right? So late 1800s, early 1900s. So I have a lot, and we can have a conversation about John Muir because I have a lot to say about that. But I'm actually not interested in diminishing any of their accomplishments. And what I can believe in is their commitment to their idea of wilderness conservation and the environment. But the thing for me is, I have to ask, what else was going on at the same time that they were having these conversations for all of us? They were making universal statements about how all of us should be, as though all of us are treated the same way. So it's why I think about the Homestead Act. I never thought about the Homestead Act before, as I always say, but before this, but 1862, Homestead Act, gun goes off at midnight. For the most part, if you're a European immigrant, you get to put your stake down on up to 160 acres of land. Then, if you can stay on it for 5 years, if you farm, if you build a structure like a home, if you make it through that 5-year period, that land is yours, free and clear. I still, every time I say that, that can never happen anywhere anymore, right? And land isn't simply about land ownership. It is about legacy. It is about saying you belong. It's about economic and political power, what it gives you. Right? And I'm not interested in diminishing European immigrants because many of them maybe didn't even want to leave home. They were having issues and land issues where they were. They were taking incredible risks to come to this place, which, must have been really scary to do so. I can't imagine what it was like. Something like 60% of homesteaders did not survive that experience, right? Because you could die from the common cold. Your closest neighbor was 100 miles away. We're talking about loneliness now because of COVID. Imagine what they were experiencing at that time in this country. But I also have to ask the question, who had to be removed from that land in order for them to have access, right? Not only removed, but sometimes killed, right? Two things will always be true about this country. Two things. One, that all this land was stolen. All of it was stolen. We can get 1,000 years down the road. If we look back at the beginning, all this land was stolen from the indigenous people who were here before the rest of us. Two, we enslaved another group of people to work the land for free to build the backbone of our economy. It's hard. I say these things all the time. I don't say them as an accusation. I say them as a statement of fact that we all carry. Right? For me, it is a burden that we all carry. Maybe we don't all need to be carrying it in the same way. We can have that conversation, but we all carry that burden. Here we are today, still challenging people who look like Christian Cooper, who just wants to go watch birds in the park. Here we are today, having a conversation where we can watch on video yet another Black person be killed by the police. I'm also not interested in diminishing the police and having that, because it actually simplifies a conversation that is way more complicated than that, right? One more thing. Yeah. Oh, I have the slides in the wrong order. That's actually the big house. So now, this is back to where I grew up, the estate. There's now been this locked fence on the driveway. It wasn't there when I grew up. And so I think for me, it's really symbolic, even though that's privately owned land, but even just the question that some people can buy huge swaths of land and the rest of us can't access that. It's an interesting conversation. And when we say public lands, what public are we talking about? I always say it's like that, we the people, right? Who is we the people? Who were they thinking was we the people then? Was that an aspiration? It certainly couldn't have been a truth for everybody, because we had Jim Crow segregation. We had Japanese internment. We had 3,000 Chinese build our railroad, and then they get left out of the final famous picture at the Golden Spike. That was no accident. We had so many stories of people who've come from elsewhere. And actually, I'm really clear to say that whiteness in itself is diverse. The Irish, we have so many stories of the way in which we've created hierarchies of who counts more and who gets to have input more and who gets to have power more than the rest, right? We do it all the time. We've done it all the time, and we've done it to some people more than others. So one of the last slides I want to put up here in this question of what we're trying to sustain is to say to you, when I have to think about myself, because I actually think there's a certain amount of work that is for the individual to do, right? It's not my job to do it for you. It's not your job to do it for me. And I have to get real with where I stand. Where are my bias? And bias is not the same as prejudice, and it's not the same as racism, but man, they're like close cousins. And if you're not looking at them and paying attention, and if you don't acknowledge what they are, it can cross over and become something else, right? So this story is from maybe 5-6 years ago now. His name was Ian Gibson, and Ian Gibson was a sport hunter. And I had read about this online. His story wasn't as famous as about 6 months later, there was a white American sport hunter, a dentist, who ended up going sport hunting and killing the lion that was like the grandson of like some famous lion. Maybe it was the MGM lion. I don't remember which famous lion. But his was a story that really stuck with me because I was reading it online. He'd gone to South Africa. There were both Black and white South Africans with him. He was hunting, they were out hunting elephant, and he got too close to a young bull elephant and it gored him to death. And so I'm reading about this story. I believe he was 53 years old at the time. And then I got down to the comment section, and the comment section is always brutal, right? So, but I hung in there for 45 minutes. At the end of the comment section, I was nearly in tears because the comments were brutal. I mean, there was one comment in there that had some compassion for him. The rest of them said stuff like, he got what he deserved. One for the elephant. It just kept going like that. And here's the thing. I don't understand sport hunting. I don't know why anybody would want to do it. I simply do not agree with him on the question of hunting a live thing for sport. I don't get it. He and I seemingly have nothing in common. But here's the thing. If I can't find empathy for him, if he were alive, how would we ever sit down and have a conversation about it and decide how we are going to mutually move forward? And I refuse to relinquish my humanity in order to make my point, because I actually believe it's possible to make a point and have a space to stand in order to make change without diminishing anyone else to do it. Now, I put it up next to this young African-American boy, and this was a story about Flint, Michigan, all that lead being put in the water, all those adults who knew about it for a long time, and the impact that this is going to have on those children over time. This story for me, I don't have any work to do. I mean, I look at that it's instant compassion. It's instant, like he's a child, he's African-American, that wasn't his fault. But back over here to Ian Gibson, I got to work a little harder, right, to find that. So I have an understanding of where my work is to do. And so the question is for me, as it is, I think for everybody, what is the work that we each have to do? And we can talk about these things. These are just some things I put up there, and I want to get into conversation, but I can come back to the slide and somebody can ask me if they want to come back to here. If I had to pick one thing out of here that really sticks with me is that the idea, and it's funny, I didn't put it up here, but I always say it. Diversity is not about assimilation. It is not about assimilation, right? Because really, it's about actually engaging across difference. And it's also, and I never use the term outreach anymore. It's something that I say to people. And I understand that outreach comes from a really good place. But what outreach means for me is that I get to outreach to you, which is kind of a power thing. I get to bring you to my table, no matter how well intended it is. I make space for you at my table. And then you have to proceed to learn everything about my table. You have to know everything. I actually don't have to know anything about you. The table never changes. I've just made a little space for you there. I'm much more interested in a relationship of reciprocity, which actually means you might have to throw out the table, which I think is sometimes part of the resistance to hiring, to bringing in people who are different, because it means you have to change. And so what I always say to organizations as well as individuals is, before you even invite anybody to be in a relationship with you, what is the capacity building work you need to do in order to make room for that relationship? Because I know I've been on that side where I've gotten invited in by well-intended and well-meaning people, and then I'm the only one who looks like me in the room. I've got to do all the explaining. I've got to hold it up. There's microaggressions flying all over the place. People don't mean it. They keep telling me I didn't mean that, but they don't attend to the impact of their good intentions. And then I leave. And you hear this happens a lot with a lot of Black and brown folks who get hired, get brought into boards, but they don't stay. And you wonder why they don't stay. And part of it is that they can't deal with that the organization has no sense of their difference in the room and has made no attempt to actually expand. And I'm talking about good people. This isn't about bad people or people who aren't nice or people who don't have the ability to see further. It's just people, how can I say this gently? That's actually what white privilege is. Whiteness is diverse. Whiteness is not a bad thing. Nobody can help the skin they were born in. But as James Baldwin says it, whiteness is about power. So to understand that by simply being born with skin doesn't mean you haven't had a hard time in your life. But there's a way within which everything is operated at times so subtly here in this country, from the way we privilege certain policies over others, academic curriculums, who we see in the movies, who gets chosen. We've all heard the studies, we've seen the things over and over again. And some of us have lived it over and over again. And for me, it's a digging deep that's really needed. This is a consciousness shifting thing. This isn't a Band-Aid solution with a few goals and you're going to get there by next year. This is an ongoing process because difference and diversity have always been here. The minute Christopher Columbus lost his way and stepped on this land, it got more diverse, right? It did. So we've always been here. So the question is, how might we move forward differently now? And these are just some other ideas we can talk about. I'll just pull out one of them. I always think about relational versus universal, that the impulse is sometimes to use universal language, to say, well, all the people, and sort of erase that difference in the room, the unequal power relations, to really kind of get to kumbaya before actually doing the work and seeing what people's challenges actually are first, and thinking about it more in a relational way than a universal way. And I always just like this picture. I just think it's really lovely. The last thing I will say is this, for me, is never about being comfortable, right? So how do we take a risk in order to gain something, as opposed to taking a risk because we're afraid of losing? That for me is not a place of strength, taking a risk because you're afraid of losing something. But taking a risk in order to gain, there's a kind of agency, there's a kind of true intention there. That's that I'm going to take a leap, because this is going to be a leap of faith for a lot of people. For a lot of other people, it's like, yeah, we've been here ready to leap for a long time. Actually, we've been in midair for a long time. But for others, this is kind of a first time situation. So the last story I want to say is that when I think about risk and the fact that this is not about being comfortable, is a few years ago, Michelle Martin had Svetlana Alexievich on, and Svetlana Alexievich had just won a Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. And she's from Belarus. And the thing that Michelle Martin was saying to her on NPR was that saying, you made a lot of your own people really mad, because it's like she aired all the dirty laundry about the Belarusian government and what was happening over there. And what Svetlana Alexievich said back to her was, she said, I love my people, but I'm not interested in my people being comfortable. I'm interested in my people being better. So there, I want to stop there, because, I could keep going. See, if no one interrupts me, John, this is what happens. And sort of open it up to your thoughts, comments. And also to say that all questions are good questions for me. And this isn't about you have to agree with me or, or anything like that. It's really an opportunity to see what's in the room and how we might conversate with each other.
Neil Pizzullo is going to feed you some questions now from the chat.
Okay.
Well, I have no questions yet, but I've come up with just a question that is kind of tangentially related to the topic. You started speaking about outdoor spaces where you grew up, which is just a phenomenal place.
Yes, yes.
What's your experience of living in Vermont?
Oh, so I only moved here. I've only been here a year, but I've probably been coming back and forth to Vermont since 2005 because I started working with a group called the Center for Whole Communities. And at the time when the organization started, it was in the Mad River Valley on Knoll Farm. And so Peter Forbes and Helen Wybrow started that organization. And it was, at the time, we'd bring in groups of people, of 20 people who didn't know each other from around the country to have conversations about race, land, and place. And I became one of the co-facilitators and eventually joined the board. So every summer I was out here for a few times. And then University of Vermont, over the time I got to know people there who would invite me out. And so I have a lot of friends here. But I just have to tell you that I told people there's no way I'm ever moving here. And I just want you to know that you can never say never. I also want to say to you that and I've lived a lot of places, probably 19 places since I was 19. I had a whole different career as an actor for many years. I lived overseas. I've lived a lot of places. I am so happy that I'm living in Vermont right now. This is what I want to say. I understand it very differently. And what I meant by that was more that I'm a big city girl. Like I've lived in Utah and all kinds of places, but I really feel at home in big cities. Boy, give me London, Tokyo, New York, San Francisco. I am just at home in a very particular way. And nature is everywhere. So I don't feel bereft when I'm in an urban environment. But I just thought, oh my God, this place is too small. How could I ever be here? And actually, I live in downtown Burlington, right? That was the closest. I got to be where things are going and I can walk around like a New Yorker does. I found it to be, I'm here very intentionally, right? Middlebury, I had this part-time residency in their environmental school there to have these conversations, to teach a class, to work with the campus, and this was all before George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, all this stuff happened, right? So this was, I talked about this with Nan Jinks, who was the incredible dean at the time of the environmental school. We kind of worked it out, like how could we come up with something that would serve us both, and I could work on some new projects and be here. And then all of this stuff happened. So I'm finding Vermont to be the place to be because of the pandemic. I mean, I feel very privileged and fortunate to be in a space that you have a lot of people who are trying to work well together around that. It's interesting to be in one of the whitest states in the country, but I sense a real desire. I just know a lot of people here who are just really making an effort. And there's something about that when there's a common effort, even if though it's coming from different places, that provides a different kind of energy in a space. The spirit is different. I think I can say that with this group. The spirit is different. And that's something that I actually really feel here. I live on the second floor of a 2-story house. So, the two young women who live downstairs are farmers. They always leave me every couple of weeks. There's a bag of fresh produce at the bottom of my stairwell just because they want to, I know my neighbors on either side. I'm just like, this is fantastic. And I just want to tell you all, though, that the bread is too good. So stop making such good bread here in Vermont because, yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
Okay. Well, we've picked up a couple questions here. I'm going to just summarize one. It comes from the group FACT, Faith Communities Together, it's a board about 10 people, interfaith really, for all practical purposes. The question really comes down to how can an interfaith grassroots environmental organization such as ours develop more diversity in our membership?
Yeah.
Because we are basically, I'll speak for myself, I'm white middle class.
Yeah.
I can't help it. I was born into it.
You can't, that's, you know, none of us can help the skin we were born into. That's what it is. That's a great question. And one of the reasons I know I got invited here today, and, you know, you always have to be careful what you say because somebody is listening closely. So I had spoken back in April online at Oberlin for Earth Day, and John Elder was listening. And at some point, somebody asked me a question about faith-based communities or churches. And I said, well, what's funny, I've never been asked by a faith-based group. That's why when he reached out, he said, I heard you say you've never been asked, so I'm asking you to come have this conversation. I think there's some probably foundational, principle is not the right word, it's too strong, foundational practices that a faith-based group can use that it wouldn't be different from any other group. And part of it is, you know, because you are a diverse congregation of faiths and people, which I think is great. So great start, right? There's already diversity in the space. Is what are other groups you can collaborate with that exist outside of the faith-based experience, right? So how do you, if you haven't already, build and start to create relationship? What's going on with a lot of outdoor and environmental groups in your area? What's going on with a lot of, you know, after school programs? What's going on with, you know, public schools, private organizations, the YMCA, your Boys and Girls Club, you know, all the places that, you know, may or may not have people who are intentional about their faith and their practice of their faith, but are living in the community with you. And what does it look like then to start conversations? The thing that I would offer is, one of the things that has happened since George Floyd was murdered for me is, you know, before COVID, I was on a plane every week. I only go somewhere when I'm invited. And I've been fortunate, I've been invited a lot. So I've been, you know, the last number of years, it's been pretty much every week I'm on a plane somewhere doing this, doing some version of this. But it is nothing like the amount of requests that I'm getting now. There's just is nothing like it. I'm overwhelmed. I'm grateful. But the point that I want to make about it is that some of those requests, so some of them, this is the work I do, this is how I make a living, this is how I, you know, what I believe in. But some of it is organizations who are looking to diversify their boards, who are looking to diversify their staff, but in particular boards. And they may ask me, you know, oh, would you consider? I understand the impulse because, you know, I'm in these conversations all the time, and I understand the impulse to ask and say, we need to get a brown person on our board. You know, I would ask you not to start there. Because
tells us into the next question.
Yeah, okay.
How do environmental groups build capacity to include everyone and develop relationships, which you've kind of already answered, what can environmental groups do to welcome people of color?
Well, you know, what would any group do to welcome anybody? So there's something foundational about remembering. Yes, there may be some a new skill set you have to develop because you hadn't thought about race or ethnicity in a very particular way. But I would hope, you know, how are you raised? Like, to remember what does hospitality look like? Sometimes people forget that, right? It's like, oh, we're doing the work now of diversity. It's like, sometimes it's basic hospitality. I had a Zoom call earlier today with a group that works with the UN Foundation, and they're thinking about working with me. It was a dream. I do so many of these calls lately to see, like, are we going to work together? You know, should we do this thing? All we did for an hour was talk personally about who each other is. And the CEO, she said, you know, I know your time is really valuable, but I want us to get to know each other. I said, no, this is the work. I said, this got me more excited about working with you than anything you could have told me about how much you were going to pay me or what we were going to do down the road. But actually, you took the time to ask me questions about my life. I'm asking about yours. We're laughing. We're finding our way together. We're determining whether or not, can we trust each other? Is there a foundation here for us to begin to think of this work? We want to have a relationship. We don't want this to be transactional, and we definitely don't want this to be about extraction. And this is often where it goes, well-meaning or not, that engaging with a non-white group or individual, and many of them already know this, which is why they may seem reluctant to actually engage, because often it's a transaction. Yeah. Or it becomes an extraction. You know, you're going to extract from us information, or, you know, but what's in it for us? And it sounds cold for me to say that, and I'm saying it like that to say that reciprocity actually means that there should be something shared for both. But the only way you will know that is if you take the time to ask them what it is that they're thinking about, prioritizing, and, you know, and actually to dispel assumptions that they're not already engaged. You know,
it's almost like you can see the next question coming up because you've almost already answered it.
I can. It's like a thing because we got something going on. That's what's happening.
You said this comes from so did you say Black people are the biggest voter group on environmental issues? If so, talk about why that is, because to us it seems counterintuitive because so much of the environmental movement seems like it's white.
Yeah, I mean, I learned and I met some people in the Black Caucus that the Black Caucus as a voting bloc is the biggest, you know, vote pro-environment. So think about how you have significant African-American populations in urban centers. That's not the only place African-Americans live, but you have significant populations in urban centers. Some of the concerns in urban centers having to do with the environment, like clean air, brownfields, asthma, you know, food deserts, you know, can live in a neighborhood that doesn't have any place where you can get fresh food. You know, people, this is again where I want to separate, you know, we often privilege thinking about, you know, like this picture I have here now is also part of the estate. I mean, it's stunning, right? You're looking at the estate thinking it's about going and getting that spiritual connection. Oh, we lost it. Oh no, you're back. I see what happened. Okay.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
No, it's okay. You've just become full. I can see you full face. That's fine.
That's got to be a scary sight.
I know. I lost my way there. We think about how we are. I'm going to go back to this picture for a second. Yes. I know I have to. Sorry, I have to get out. I lost you there now. If we think about the fact that we often privilege thinking about the outdoors as a place of recreation, and then who we're unable to see because of that. So I lived in Florida for a year, a number of years ago, and I was doing some work with Everglades National Park. There's Biscayne National Park, which is there in Big Cypress National Preserve. And one of the things, I lived in Miami, and Miami is an hour away from Florida, the Everglades, the actual national park. And at the time, the predominantly white staff at the park, this is back in the sort of mid 2000s, was saying that we want to get more African-American Latinx folks out here. You know, what are the issues? And some of it was about, you know, public access. Not everybody can afford a car. But I remember one of them saying, you know, well, but, you know, Black people, they're not engaged, you know, they're not thinking about the environment. And I said, this is what's so interesting. If you drive around South Florida, now the Everglades as an actual place expands way beyond the park borders. You can see every day Black and brown people fishing on the canals. They're there every day. Getting food to put on the table, enjoying themselves, socializing. They're there every day. When I said that to somebody said, oh yeah, but that's not counted. And that's actually the crux. That's why sort of the myth is, you know, what gets valued, what counts, who do we see, who do we not even notice that could be right under our noses doing whatever it is they're doing, you know, because it doesn't look like something we would do. It doesn't look like us, you know, whoever us is, you know. So for me, it's expanding what counts as environmental. People vote based on, in many ways, I think, based on their feeling, what they need, what they believe in, what they love, and wanting to protect what they love. And so part of the insult even in thinking that Black people don't care is as though we're saying Black people don't love the land, place, clean water, clean air. And of course they do. Who doesn't? Who wouldn't love those things? They just may have a different way, you know, so they're voting, but they may not be showing up at the big environmental organizations to join those folks, because some of those organizations, when they were founded, weren't founded with them in mind. You don't see a lot of Native people in those organizations. You don't see a lot of Latinx people, Asian, I mean, you know, biracial, multiracial. It doesn't mean that they don't exist in those organizations. I know a lot of people who are out there, but there's a reason why, because we have a history, which doesn't mean it isn't changing. And the other thing I want to say is that the environmental justice movement rose in part out of the fact that the mainstream environmental movement didn't seem to want to address anything having to do with Black and brown and poor communities that were living in cities and dealing with really unattractive environmental issues. They're unattractive. Who wants to talk about a brownfield? Who wants to talk about that chemical company dumping toxic waste? Who wants to talk about Cancer Alley? Because all of the bad air, or what's in the water, that's not really, it's really, can we talk about polar bears instead? It's really, they're so cute. And look, I believe we can do both. And that's the thing. We don't have to give one up over the other. But that's the other thing. People are going to look at an organization and say, are they speaking to me? And are they speaking about me? Can they see me? Do they see my experience? Is there room for me to bring my experience to the table in relationship to everyone else's experience? When they start using language to talk about a place, this whole idea that somehow nature is separate from human beings, that came from the West, y'all. Indigenous people weren't saying that. We're actually part of nature. We have foundational ways that we organize and even think about what non-human nature is. We've taken for granted, we've made it the norm. It's the center, so that everybody else who's operated for millennia differently in relationship to non-human nature is considered marginal.
Yeah, that's true. We got a couple questions. You've kind of touched on the answer, but let me move on to this question here.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on the words humility and authenticity with respect to how NGOs can broaden the umbrella? P.S. I went to Virginia Tech, so I know Floyd well, and went to UVM for my PhD and live in Cleveland, and we have a bakery that is the best.
Oh man, of course you do. So of course you do. I love it. I really like that question because I just wrote down, I have to write it down so I remember, humility and authenticity. Oh man, humility. So this is, well, let's start with authenticity first, because, authenticity for me is how are we our authentic selves, which implies we know what that is. So let's say we're talking about an organization, but an organization is you're always talking about individuals, right? An organization is made up of individuals. So you can look at it at the scale of the organization and look at the mission statement. Look at how things are framed, how things are done. Words that are used, the goal that we want to get to, this isn't a goal. Like, how do you even decide? How do you decide to come correct, right? So part of being authentic is, are you willing to show your vulnerability? Both humility and authenticity point to vulnerability. And I'm talking about radical vulnerability. I don't mean given, cracking open your chest and bleeding till you got nothing left. I'm talking about a vulnerability that's a real strength. I can say, I don't know. I can say, wow, I made a mistake, or I said that thing and I did not attend to that. Instead of saying, well, I said that thing, but I had good intentions, so I'm off the hook. That's, there's nothing vulnerable or authentic about that. But to say that I stumbled, not only did I stumble once, I stumbled 5 times and made a mistake. And I'm still here anyway. That's authentic. It's authentic to reveal some of the fault lines. Where are the fault lines? And do you know where they are? So that you're able to say, if somebody, in this case, a Black or brown person you're interested in building a relationship with and engaging with is coming in, what are you willing to tell the truth about? You have to be willing to tell the truth as you understand it. That's how healing happens. That's how reconciliation happens. And that's where humility, for me, is born. Humility in that we are all human. Ain't nobody got this down perfect. I certainly don't. It's not like I make mistakes on the regular. I just try not to, but I do. And so the authenticity is, because what it allows people to do is to see that there's room for them. It's not about a certain language that I must adapt and adopt in order to fit, to assimilate. It is not a certain way that I have to look. It's not a certain thing that I have to believe in. I mean, you are, as I understand it, a faith-based community that has people are, believe in a lot of different things, that practice many different faiths. So at your core, you actually already have a principle that serves. The idea that it is not all about believing the same thing in the same way, but it is understanding that together we are way stronger than apart, and we can have a set of common aspirations about where we want to go. Does that make sense?
Not only does that make sense, that's a perfect segue to our FACT business meeting, which we are about to begin. But first of all, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Carolyn. We really appreciate it. And we hope in other ways, maybe actually physically, person to person,
I would love that.
With us again.
I would love that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being open to the conversation. I always learn something too, because, how to be present and engaged. And yes, let's make it so. 2021, man. We'll get out of 2020. 2021, we'll be in person.
We move now to our FACT meeting. Those of you who are members who've been participating in FACT, we urge you to stay. This will be a short business meeting, but it's a very important one. If you don't consider yourself or don't know whether you're a member of FACT yet, but you really are interested in the organization, please do stay and learn. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ron Prozac, our president, to begin our business meeting.